threatened species and ecological communities now on the National Threatened Species List, so the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So about 500 animals and 1,300 plant species. And the 80 threatened ecological communities are in addition to that. So we have, I guess, a tremendous and increasing responsibility to arrest the decline in these species and communities and ideally recover them as part of conserving our national heritage. We also have an increasing number of developments, whether they be residential or transport or mining, which are being proposed over time. And a lot of these have the risk of having an impact on these threatened species and communities. So this graph shows the number of, the number of referred actions to the Department of the Environment and Energy over time from 2001 to 2013. And the red line shows the number of actions which are considered to potentially have a significant impact on threatened species, and so require a formal assessment and eventual approval by the Minister for the Environment. Of those developments that eventually are approved, some of them may require some of these residual impacts to be compensated for using offsets. So these are measures that are taken after avoidance and mitigation measures are taken to reduce the impact on these threatened species. Now, biodiversity or environmental offsets are measures that are taken to compensate for these impacts to biodiversity by generating equivalent biodiversity gains elsewhere. And as I said, these are measures that are taken after avoidance and mitigation measures are taken. And the international standard, which is written by the Biodiversity or Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, is that offsets must achieve a no net loss and preferably a net gain of biodiversity on the grounds. Under the EPBC Act in Australia, offsets must deliver an overall conservation outcome that improves or maintains the viability of the protected matter. So the Australian government's policy is very much in line with the international standard, and it's also one of the only policies in the world that is underpinned by a scientifically robust methodology. So this is work that was led by Phil Gibbons, Martine Marin and myself, and a lot of others. David Lindemeyer is also in the room, which developed this methodology for quantifying biodiversity impacts and the offset requirements that are needed to compensate for these impacts. And this was also work that started a number of years ago. A lot of the researchers involved in the current NESP TSR project on offsets were working with the Department of the Environment a number of years ago as part of the National Environmental Research Program, so the precursor to NESP. And we helped in the development of this EPBC Act offsets policy and the guide as part of this program. Now, Australia is not the only place in the world where offsetting is used. There's actually 69 countries around the world that either have offset policies in place or in development. It's also a fairly controversial tool, despite being very widely used. So just as an example, offset policies were discussed for the last few years in the UK and the European Union. And in those places, there was actually a strong public backlash to the use of offsetting. And as a result, these policies have actually been put on hold for the moment. And just as an example, this documentary that came out last year, Banking Nature, had a highly critical view of the use of species banking and offsetting and what they call the financialisation of nature. So given the controversy and the number of issues that offsetting raises and a lot of public concern, it's really important to get this policy right. And if we're going to be using offsetting as part of our environmental policy mix in this country, we do need to get a hold on these issues. So a number of us conducted a comprehensive review of a number of these contested issues in offsetting. And this was published in Bioscience earlier this year, and a number of these people on the list are involved in the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. You may notice that we do in Australia have a very high concentration of experts who are very good at doing stuff around offsetting, but we also drew on international examples and our international collaborators. So in this paper, we categorised these contested issues into four broad themes: ethical, social, technical and governance issues. And we felt it was important to categorise these issues because I guess a lot of the concerns around offsetting are often not clearly defined, and it becomes difficult to know what a particular objection is and what you can do about it. And they vary in the level to which they can be resolved. So for example, there is a number of ethical issues around offsetting, and science can certainly help in understanding those issues, but not necessarily resolve them, given that people are always going to vary in how they value nature and their ethical stance. There's also a lot of social considerations. So, I mean, the very basis of offsetting is that we're going to be impacting something in one place and compensating for it in another place. So that implies there's going to be some kind of social inequity in access to these values by local communities. In terms of the technical and governance and policy issues, there are a lot of opportunities to resolve these. And the Project 5.1 under the NEST TSR Hub will be focusing mostly on these technical and governance issues. I will focus only on a couple of these for the remainder of the presentation. As you can see, there's a whole lot of issues that we can get into. But just as an example, the traditional way of doing an offset is usually through habitat protection and restoration. And these are sites that are usually secured with some kind of conservation covenant or turned into a protected area. And usually there's, one offset site per development site. But this model doesn't actually work for some of our threatened species. So, for example, the Tasmanian devil, protecting habitat for that species isn't necessarily going to help, given that its main threat is disease, it's devil facial tumour disease. So in terms of offsetting impacts to this species, we need to be thinking about, well, perhaps investing in research or protecting populations in disease-free locations may be more beneficial action for that species. Another couple of examples, the northern quoll and Pilbara olive snake. So these are preyed on by feral cats and foxes. So for these species, protecting a piece of habitat isn't necessarily going to be beneficial unless you also deal with those predation threats. So generally there's these some of these key issues around offsetting. We might have limited ecological information about a species, so we're not entirely sure about its distribution or what its key threats are. It might not be possible to protect habitat in a certain location due to tenure constraints, or in a marine location that makes things even more difficult. We're not talking about land. And it is, as in the examples I mentioned before, habitat protection might not be the most beneficial action for particular species. So what do we do in those situations? I just wanted to highlight some data that I've collected through my PhD research, where I spoke to a large number of people from a range of sectors, so from government, from the environmental sector, from industry, from NGOs, and I wanted to get an understanding from all these different perspectives, what were the key issues they felt were needed to be addressed to improve offset policy in Australia. And what I found was that overwhelmingly across the board, everyone wanted to get better outcomes from offset policy. And a lot of these, I guess, technical and policy and governance issues were raised as opportunities for improvement. So, for example, focusing on threats other than habitat loss, or to more strategic delivery of offsets across the landscape. And as we've heard a little bit today already, we've already got a lot of some exciting science happening, which is going to help to inform these better offsets. So Sarah and her team's work will help to understand what are the different costs and benefits of controlling cats potentially as an offset in different locations. We've had the great news last week where swift parrots are now utilising artificial hollows. And we'll hear next from Darren, whose work and his team is helping to better understand malleefowl's responses to different management actions, from managing fire and managing foxes. So this project is I guess, taking a fairly broad view, trying to bring in all the best science out there from wherever it's coming from, and overall trying to look at how do we get better offsets of threatened species by thinking beyond habitat protection, by looking at strategic delivery of offsets across the landscape, and weighing up the costs and benefits of these different actions and identifying which species could best benefit from these innovative offset options. So thank you, and I just want to acknowledge the small part of our very large team from multiple universities who are working on this project. Thank you.